Okay, okay. So we are here interviewing our dear teacher and mentor, Sandy Thompson, at her home in Santa Barbara. And we are,
Hongyin from
in,
UCLA.
and Ritva Laury from the University of Helsinki.
And I'm Sandy Thompson.
Thank you, Sandy, for allowing us to visit you and chat with you. And I think, although we have known each other for a long time, maybe people are still interested in maybe your early how you got interested in linguistics and how where you grew up, and maybe you can tell us some about your maybe some life stories.
I
Begin with that.
appreciate that. Yeah, we have spent a lot of linguistic time together, but it's true there was a time before you guys came to UCSB, and there was some UCLA time, but we'll get back to that. So if we go kind of far back, how did I get interested in linguistics? I think I've always been fascinated by language. I remember as a youngster, I began to learn how to spell and read and so forth. And I remember being very struck by the word Wednesday. And I thought to myself, we go Wednesday, but it's spelled Wednesday. And then I tried to say it faster, Wednesday, Wednesday, Wednesday. And that was my first clue, maybe as a 6 or 7 years old, about sound change and spelling, and began to get very interested in how language works. And I remember something else. Maybe I was a little bit older, and we went with my parents. I was fortunate enough to be taken to Quebec and Montreal, and we ate at a restaurant. My parents took me and my sibs to a place with the name Carriers. I don't know if it still exists, but I was again totally fascinated by this U, and I couldn't figure out how my mother could make that sound. And I would go to her while we're working in the kitchen or something. I'd say to the restaurant again, and she'd go, Carriers. So that was pretty fascinating. So I began to read books about language and word origins, and picking up whatever I could. And I decided that I might like to major in French. When I got to high school, I took French, I took Latin, I took, along with my college prep courses. And I went to university at Ohio State, which was very nice for me because it was a lot bigger than my high school. And I found high school kind of confining, but I did study French in high school. I enjoyed Latin very much. It somehow seemed to make sense. And I remember being asked to tutor one of the younger Latin students who was having some problems. And my Latin teacher asked me if I would tutor him. And I was very surprised that Latin did not make as much sense to him as it did to me. And I don't think he was wanted to think in those directions, but I loved it. And I loved French. And so a couple of years later, I decided to spend a summer in a immersive French experience, which turned out to be Montreal. And it was immersive in a slightly different way. We spoke French all the time, and morning, noon, and night with each other, with our roommates as much as we could, and we were all pretty serious. But one day I'm walking to class, and there were some guys fixing, working on the street and fixing the street with jackhammers and stuff. And one of them called out to us, hearing me and my friends trying to speak French together, and they called out to us in French. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm paying a lot of good money, putting in a lot of good time, and what am I going to have? I'm going to have what those guys have, namely, ability to speak two languages. So I thought I'd better try and think up a kind of a more elaborate plan. And I was real fortunate then at Ohio State in my junior year. Two very important contributors to the field of linguistics, very young, new PhDs. One was William S.Y. Wong, and the other was Charles J. Fillmore. And both of them turned out to have a huge influence on me. I majored in linguistics, and the Department of Linguistics was just getting started. These two guys were brought in. They had graduated from the University of Michigan, and to start a linguistics department and a Chinese program. So Bill Wong did not consider himself a language teacher, and he was willing to get the language program started, but pretty soon there became a Department of East Asian, which you know well, and a Department of Linguistics. And as both departments grew, I just kept staying there and taking more and more courses. I got my BA and I got an MA, and there just wasn't any reason not to keep going. And so I got into the PhD program, and was fortunate enough to work with both of those teachers. Influenced me in different ways. So
were they your advisors, in fact?
Yes. So for my MA, I think they were both advisors, and Bill Wong, more so because it's his language. And then for my PhD, I got to work with Chuck.
Was he teaching Chinese at that time?
Bill,
Wow.
yeah.
Oh, he was a teacher.
But as soon as he could hand that off, he did, and stick to what was more interesting to him, which was language change, language diffusion. Yeah, right.
But how did you get into Chinese language learning?
In his course. So
linguistics, of course.
Chinese.
Chinese.
At first, yeah. So I was studying all the, trying to branch out linguistically and in terms of languages. So I took a quarter of Russian, and then I marched into his office late in the quarter, like Thanksgiving time. And I said, I want to be one of your linguistics majors. I hear there's a major starting up. And I said, I've had French and German and Russian. And he basically said, Indo-European, which you can both relate to because, and so he said, I'm starting up a Chinese class next quarter, and I think it would be good if you were right there. And I did that, and then I've never looked back. And I've been a student of Chinese ever since. But then, eventually I got learning some more Finnish thanks to you. So I've certainly branched out a bit from my Indo-European start, but that was a good start. Latin has served me well, at French and German, of course, but yeah.
Were they your most important mentors, would you say, in your student years?
Yeah. I was also lucky to study with Ilse Leista, from whom I learned a huge amount, but I knew that my basic interests were in, grammar, syntax, morphosyntax, and so I learned a whole lot from her. I enjoyed talking to her, and every so often she would honor me with taking me to lunch at the faculty club, and I just learned a whole lot. But yeah, those two were my main mentors. Yeah.
At that time, there were not a lot of linguistics department in the U.S.
That's right. Yeah, very few.
So somehow Ohio State got this started with the linguistics department.
Right. And I think it was a number of folks who were interested in linguistics in a variety of departments, like a lot of linguistics departments start out that way. And I remember some of them. Leonard Newmark was influential for me. And he was there advising me a little bit what kinds of things to get into. But yeah, there weren't many linguistics departments at all. And so when I got my PhD, I had a number of job offers that's to make our current grads, weep, because places were looking around and seeing, linguistics. And of course, I was getting also training in MIT linguistics, and Chomsky was beginning to be noticed, and linguistics departments began to spring up. So yeah, I had several job offers, and I had a nice choice.
And then you picked UCLA?
I did.
Why?
Well, I visited each of the campuses I was considering. One was Hawaii, and one was Queens, and one was UCLA, and I forget where else. And of those, I was pretty young, not knowing what my life would be like, but Hawaii seemed kind of far away, and Manhattan was a little bit, Queens and the whole New York scene was a little bit unfamiliar to me. Let's put it that way. It was a world I couldn't really understand, but I could understand UCLA. I knew the kind of thing they were doing. It was a growing, big, thriving department with a lot of variety. So, and they were keen on getting someone specializing in Chinese and Japanese. And so I was hired at the same time as a Japanese specialist named George Bedell. And so we were kind of went through being at UCLA together for years. Yeah. I, at the time, and others have said this to me too, I had a job talk in February, and I got on a plane in February in Columbus, Ohio. And it was a blizzard and freezing cold. And I got off the plane in LA, palm trees and the ocean, and I simply couldn't imagine how anybody got any work done. I don't even know how I gave a job talk, because I would just look out the window and be transported. I just imagined all of my colleagues would be, sitting under a palm tree at the
So for the place.
Really? So not like Columbus, Ohio. No, I really couldn't quite figure out how they would get any work done, but clearly they were, because they gave me a tour of something called the English Syntax Project that was going on, and it all looked very enticing.
Who was there then?
Well, the person that hired me was Bob Stockwell, who is a specialist in English Anglistics, I guess, and Bill Welmers, who is a very, very prominent Africanist. And so it was all the time I was at UCLA, there was I had African specialists as my colleagues. And that was very, very enriching. So I got to have a number of African specialist students, including some African students, while I was at UCLA. I thought that was wonderful. And I read Bill Welmer's book. Bill Bright was there doing socio-cultural linguistics, and I learned so much from those people. Paul Schachter became a very, very good colleague and friend. Vicki Fromkin. So at the time I was hired, that was kind of the core. Yeah.
Probably, from your Ohio State days to UCLA, probably the focus was on, syntax, grammar, those kind of things. How did you pick up, the discourse, pragmatic aspect of the research from there?
That's right. For a while, I was while in grad school, I was kind of a true believer in Chomskyan approaches to language. It was all so new, and we were all so. Bill Wong and Chuck Fillmore had been like a little cell group at Michigan, kind of coming out of descriptive linguistics. And I, for a while, took a kind of a dim view of descriptive linguistics, partly influenced by, Chomskyan rhetoric and stuff. But I got over that pretty quickly. And what really made a difference for me in terms of the direction I've taken since then was Paul Hopper. So, Paul published a paper about how you could view, as you two know, I keep assigning it on tense and aspect, especially aspect in discourse, and a difference in discourse between foregrounded and backgrounded information. I'm sure we all went through this together. And it was the first hint that I had that you can start looking at data and stretches of interactions, written, spoken, whatever. And he really opened my eyes to it. I wrote him a fan letter, and by
he wasn't in the West Coast. He wasn't in the West Coast.
No, he was at that time.
Upstate New York?
Yeah, upstate New York. Yeah, he was teaching at Binghamton. And we became very good friends and co-authors and would meet at conferences and talk. And I also learned a whole lot from him. So from that point on, things were different from me. And I stopped relying on intuitions. I had written a paper with a couple of student friends about the problems with seeking out grammaticality judgments. It's a minefield if I were lucky enough not to know that firsthand, but it's a very difficult thing to run around and base your understanding of language on what people say they could get. Do you get this sentence? And I just was very dissatisfied. So when Paul came along and gave me these ideas, I said, I'm not making up any more sentences for asking people what they think of it. I'm going to teach his fault. So
at the same time, you started working with Charles.
That's right.
A lot.
That's
so, and also you are not the same institution. So how did that collaboration? Of course, you two work on the Mandarin grammar, the reference grammar, which has been so influential. So how did your collaboration with Charles?
That's a bit of a funny story too. I began working with Charles in the early 70s, with Paul not until about the late 70s, as Paul's paper came out. 76 or 8, something like that. Anyway, I went to an LSA meeting. I had done a fair amount of work on Chinese, had spent some time in Taiwan, which was the only Chinese-speaking place that I could go at that time. And I went to hear a paper by this grad student from Berkeley named Charles Lee.
Oh,
And whatever it was he was talking about, he was, of course, very animated. And I later on asked him a question about the talk he had given me, and he answered it, and I thought we had achieved intersubjectivity. And he, after the talk, he sought me out, this small room at the LSA, and he said, I'd like to talk to you more. You clearly have thought about these things, and you gave me an interesting comment, and that's how that started. I think my comment was a minor criticism. So
that got his attention.
that's right. And he hadn't had anyone, I think, to really talk about his interest in Chinese syntax. So we began to work together after that, and he was teaching. After he graduated from Berkeley, he did a dissertation on compounds in English.
English or not Chinese?
That's right. That's right. For a series of reasons, I think he worked with Carl Zimmer at Berkeley. So he graduated from Berkeley and got a job here at UCSB. It's not very far from UCLA, especially for him. At the time he was single, he had this little VW, and it would take him 3 minutes to pack and decide to jump in that little yellow VW and come down to UCLA. So I came up here, he went down there, and that's how we worked together.
And you even went to China to did field work.
We did. That's right.
At that time, you were able to go and spend time there.
And that's a whole different, a real interesting time. And I could talk a little bit about it. We were not easily able to get into People's Republic. This was about
1970.
Late 70s. Yeah, the Cultural Revolution was over. And even Deng Xiaoping had begun his reforms by 1980, right? Yeah. And so we could go, but they were very hesitant to have us go outside of Beijing. And we wanted to be doing some field work in somewhat west of Beijing. And we had great difficulty. They just wouldn't consider it.
At that time you were still working on the reference plan.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's right. I think we turned in the manuscript just before we went to China.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so the way it worked was Charles had a cousin who was teaching at the University of Inner Mongolia. And he wrote to the cousin and said, could you just arrange for us to come and spend a few months there? And that's how we got there. And that was a very interesting experience for both of us. For Charles in one way, and for me in the other ways. I had not been to China. Neither of us had ever been to that part of China. And we managed to do a little field work on a variety of northwestern Mandarin, let's say.
But a lot of contact.
Yes, absolutely. So Guanxi was very played a huge role in that trip to China. Yeah.
But you managed to write the reference grammar without ever going to.
That's right.
China.
Right. And for that, without particular apology, I know better now, we relied on Charles's intuitions. And that had served us fairly well, although already at that time he had been out of China for a couple of decades. So people have said that some of the sentences that we put in the reference grammar sound a little, perhaps. Yeah. And Charles had very little opportunity to speak Mandarin after he got
At that
here.
time, did you both go to Taiwan or it's after?
Yes, so we went to Taiwan before China, at least twice. I was going pretty regularly because I had good contacts in Taipei. And Charles went once of those trips, and we spent several months there. And that time we had begun to work on the acquisition of tone by Mandarin kids. And that was a wonderful project. Yeah.
The data collected mainly from Taiwan, Taipei.
Yeah. Yeah. We didn't collect any child data in when we were in China.
Right.
Yeah. The interesting thing about Inner Mongolia at that time was that the government had wanted to make it easy for lots of Han Chinese people to move to Inner Mongolia. Because they had had a lot of unrest there during the Cultural Revolution. It was especially, hard. And so they wanted to try and keep a good number of Chinese. So they were coming from all different places. Yeah. So that wasn't a time, but the Mandarin tone acquisition, that went on in Taiwan. Yeah. I call it urban field work. I would get on the bus with a giant sized, very fine Ewer tape recorder, reel to reel. And I would lug it into the homes of the families. And very quickly I realized I needed to hire a Chinese grad student to go with me, a young woman, and she could talk to the mom while I would interview the child with a picture book or something. And that worked very well. Otherwise, the moms couldn't care less about my research. They wanted to talk to me in
English or Mandarin?
in Mandarin. And that was too much. I couldn't talk to the kids and talk to the mom. So after that, it worked better. And we found out, as you know, that Chinese kids acquire tone way before they acquire the consonants and vowels. So tune, prosody, all those things matter very early on. I thought that was a pretty exciting finding.
Yeah, that's cool. So, and then later on, you also have worked on Korean and Japanese. What is it about that part of the world? These languages.
Yes. This is interesting too. It's I had these opportunities fall in my lap, and you were one of them. When I at UCLA, so the Korean connection was a student who became one of my TAs, one of my RAs, and his name is Hyo-sang Lee. And I began to work with him on his dissertation and become quite fascinated with Korean. And got interested then when I came to UCSB in Japanese, because one of your fellow students, of course, Yoshi Ono, came to see me and wanted to talk about doing some projects together. And that was another great gift to me. And I began to work with him. So little by little, I could absorb something about these two languages. And now it's well known that Japanese and Korean share so much of the structure without sharing their phonology or their morphophonology. So again, I've just been so fortunate. Everything I learn about language has been so fascinating. And Hmong was a language of the year at UCSB. We began our small department with the luxury of having funding to do a language of the year. And one year it was Hmong because we had a large number of Hmong immigrants into Santa Barbara at that time. And so I got to work on Hmong for a couple of years, finding it structurally much closer to Mandarin than Korean and Japanese were, which is no big surprise. And then one time, for 2 years, I think, the language of the year was Finnish, and that was thanks to you. And I learned a whole lot about Finnish discourse and conversation and grammar. So I can't consider myself a specialist in any of these languages, but it's broadened my perspective a huge amount and really, I think, set the stage for me to become able to teach courses in typology, which I have always very much felt lucky to be able to do. Yeah.
But then there's also WAPO.
Yes.
How did you get into that? And you even wrote the reference grammar of
That's
WAPO.
true. I did.
How did that start?
Well, that goes back to Charles Lee. So at one point, he has a huge amount of energy still, but in those days, 20 times more. And he said at Berkeley, he had gotten to know a number of people who were working on Native American languages, and especially languages of the Northern California. And he said he knew of a linguist, a field worker named Shirley Silver, and she had been working with WAPO, which I had never heard of. Charles hadn't either, and no one that I've ever talked to has ever heard of WAPO. But she was looking for some younger scholars to continue working on this language. And Charles said, well, let me talk to Sandy. And we went up there and met the speaker and met Shirley, and there started another wonderful
When was that?
collection.
When you started?
So this would have been soon after Charles and I started working together. So that would be the late 70s.
Oh my.
And we began.
SSB?
Yes,
People?
yes, yes. So I would drive to Santa Barbara, and then Charles would drive us up to the Russian River area, and we would stay in Healdsburg and go out to the rancheria where our speaker, Laura, lived. And at the time, we were keen on just getting the language down, and we made hundreds of reel-to-reel tapes. We would interview her and get to know her, and she would give us a lot of data, and we would take it back and pore over it and work on it and so forth. And that went on for a long time, until Laura passed away in the 90s. By that time I was here, and we could make these trips a little more easily from here, but we set to work really trying to put together the things we had. At that time, I knew more about discourse than when we started, but Laura didn't feel that she was a good storyteller. So we were kind of reluctant to, keep begging her to tell us some stories. And I'd say, well, tell us what would you advise one of your kids or grandkids, they're getting married, what should they keep in mind? Things like that. So we have a little bit of discourse, any kind of longer thing. But she was clearly not that comfortable with doing that, but she was fine at the sentence level.
She was the last speaker, so she didn't have anybody to talk to.
That's right.
Yeah.
She used to speak it with her family. Her mother was I think at least partially, if not fully blind. So Laura didn't have to go to the school that would have forced her not to speak her language. So she got to speak Wapo with her sister and her mother for much longer than most of the other indigenous folks up there could do. Yeah. So she could easily remember how to say things. She had no problem with vocabulary. She called Charles Chinaman, and and she would continually ask us if it wouldn't be time for her to have a luce, which is a cigarette. I think it's related to the Spanish word. And Charles would say, no, we have to get through this verb paradigm first. And he'd say, come on, Chinaman, give me a cigarette. So we got a little bit of secondhand smoke that way. But we also got good data. Yeah. So I was very, very fortunate. I always said I thought Laura's sense of values was very similar to mine, although we grew up in radically different environments, of course. Interestingly, the Russian River Valley at that time was beginning to be wine country. So Charles and I had a very good time collecting and going over our data and trying out new wineries.
Yeah. You suffered the secondhand smoke, so then you have the wine.
That's right. They counterbalance. It was all worth it. Yeah, Laura was a master basket maker. So when she first met us, she couldn't quite figure out what we were after. Why didn't she care about the deer catching the bear when she wanted to talk about going down to the river where you collect up the reeds and how you soak them and dry them and weave the baskets. But when I got very recently, actually, probably after 2000, I was able to learn that at our Santa Barbara Natural History Museum, there is a video of Laura and some of the other master basket makers from that neighborhood. And they all knew each other. Pomo is better known than Wapo. And some of her baskets and the other baskets are in the museum. And I've now seen that video. Seeing Laura, again after, 20 years of not seeing her certainly brought tears to my eyes. So that was another, bonus. She had a career of her own, but we had a very good relationship with her, and I was very fortunate. Yeah.
So you obviously has had such a long and productive illustration career. But looking back, what are the milestones of your linguistic career in terms of maybe research scope, research methodology, and your way of thinking? Could you describe?
Well, that's a great, thank you. I've already described a couple of pretty big milestones. Having Chuck Fillmore as an advisor, who was very original thinker and cared about semantics, which I think formal linguistics has not handled very well. He understood pragmatics and semantics, and I understand that interview with him can be seen on this same series. He was a milestone in my life, and Bill Wong working with me on Chinese was very important. I worked with someone at UCLA on developing my appreciation for semantics, and that was Bob Kersner, a proponent of what was known as the Columbia School, which is still, I think, alive and well with practitioners around in various places in the university. And I learned a lot from him. Getting exposed to all those Africanists, working with them at UCLA was very, very important for me. And a number of courses were taught. Yes, back at Ohio State, Ilse has taught a course in the structure of Estonian. I don't know if I've ever mentioned it. And I really enjoyed that. I think she enjoyed teaching it, and that exposed me to, prepared me for getting into, Finno-Ugric a little bit. And then coming to UCSB, I think, was a big milestone. In the first place, it was a department geared toward discourse and field linguistics, which was obviously very important to me and important to the others who worked with me to start this program. So that was Charles and Wally Chafe and Marianne Mithun. And very soon, Jack Dubois joined us. So there was a core, Pat Clancy. So it was a little bit of a LA to Santa Barbara migration. And we were the core of a department that was oriented towards discourse and functional approaches to language. And very soon after that, you and your fellow students arrived. And I'd say that was probably one of the major milestones for me, is getting to work with you, you wonderful students from whom I have learned so much, way more than I might ever have taught. And along the way, I mentioned, having my mind blown by Paul Hopper. So that was a big milestone. In terms of approaches, I think very early on, I was happy to identify with functionalism and what came to be known for a while as West Coast functionalism, partly maybe because of Tommy Givon. So we were colleagues at UCLA, and we team taught a couple of courses. I learned a lot from him, both about how to and how not to think about linguistic data. He was also very interested in a wide range of things, including language change and Bantu linguistics. So I learned a great deal from him as well. Then he moved to Oregon. There was our group at Santa Barbara. There were a cluster of folks small group at UCLA, and some Berkeley people, all fieldwork people, and Chuck doing his excellent work in semantics and pushing that whole approach, and a number of people, even Ron Laneker at San Diego and George Lakoff at Berkeley helped to form a kind of a core group of functional, mainly non-formalistic approaches to language. So that's been huge. But also, to go kind of far back, my meeting with Joan Bybee was Joan Hooper at that time, one of my other favorite UCLA students. So I was fortunate enough to meet with her, and she's influenced me tremendously, partly as a friend, as a colleague, as an expert and specialist in language change and morphology, which I still haven't had as much exposure to as she's provided me with. And I continue to learn from her. Discourse started with Paul Hopper. And by the time I left UCLA, I was beginning to be very influenced by a couple of students who shared advisors between me and Manny Shegla. And that got me going on the conversation and spoken language. So I began to move more towards to those areas where I have stayed since, thanks to Manny, I think, who's had me thinking nonstop since I first met him and heard about what he had to offer. And I learned from those two students, Barbara Fox and Cece Ford. So I'm still learning from them. And that's what got me interested in conversation and grammar. And I've been at that for now, what? How many? Decades, yes. 30 years, pretty much. I taught a course in conversation and grammar at a linguistics institute at New Mexico in the mid-90s. And that, just putting that course together and realizing how vast and fantastically exciting that was for me. I've been, again, very fortunate because that's where I felt so much at home. And then meeting Betty Cooper Coolin. So I've just been so lucky. She came to be a visiting scholar at UCSB, maybe while you folks were still here, mid-90s, maybe.
We had maybe left at that point,
probably.
or just, I think Hongyin and I had finished up, but so we're still visiting anyway.
Yes, and then I began working with Betty and learning so much from her too. At UCLA, Eleanor Oakes influenced me a lot. And I remember telling Eleanor at one point, I was still feeling kind of hesitant about moving into conversation because it's hard and it's messy. And I said, I've been kind of working with written text. They stand still.
Yeah.
She said something like, they stand a little too still or something. And that gave me the idea that there's all this going on when people really interact. As she kind of gently pulled me off being stuck on static forms.
That's interesting. You have written grammars of languages, and then you have worked on so much on the interactional aspect of language use. So now looking back, if you were to write another grammar using interactional data or even multimodal data, how would you go about doing that kind of grammar writing? Or you could.
I've also given that a lot of thought, and I have to say, it's very tough, isn't it? It's very hard. The more you want to be faithful to the spoken data and all the contingencies that arise out of what happens during social interaction, and yet put a grammar together, I don't think I wouldn't try to do it unless I know people have done this. There's a famous grammar by Jeffrey Heath that it's all hypertext, so you read about a paradigm, and then you could, if things worked ideally, you'd click something and you could hear that sentence. Maybe you could hear, maybe it's basically spoken language. I'm not sure it's interaction. So if you look at a typical reference grammar, you have what regularities can be found by eliciting or intuiting data, so you could say how you do the present and past and the perfect and subjunctive and all those things. But it's missing so much. And yet, if you try to look at the subjunctive use in whatever your favorite language is, it's going to take you the rest of your career just to figure out the subjunctive. So I don't really know how you can write a grammar without making some compromises. Yeah. And that's why I feel not apologetic, kind of sorry that the Mandarin reference grammar doesn't have at least examples from conversation or interaction or even interviews at least, but it's the grammar is already this big. I think it would be several volumes, but I know people are doing this. The dissertations that I've seen of people who do conversation and grammar, let's say, or interactional linguistics, typically look at one topic, like each of you did, and all the other PhD students that have come through our program, without trying to do a whole grammar, unless you did your grammar based on monologic texts. And I think that would be much easier. So that's a long answer to what's a real fraught question, I think. We all struggling with that.
Yeah. Well, what are your thoughts about then in general in linguistics and the embodied term and all of that? I mean, you kind of talked about that too in connection with grammar writing, but
yeah, how do you do that? Yeah.
My
current thinking is to follow the lead of people who are younger than I am, who have the equipment and the energy to get good data, and start out by looking at small areas. So one obvious kind of beacon here would be Lorenzo Mondada's recent book on tasting, and the data are limited to a nice domain of cheese tasting, and there's a whole book easily and very insightfully, I think. So both of you have worked on multimodal projects as well, which I think we can begin to make small strides, and I think that's the way to go. There's some nice research happening in Europe and probably elsewhere on gaze with eye tracking and special, glasses. And those are showing us a lot too. So it's going to take money. This equipment costs, and the eye tracking, devices and equipment and so forth, at all costs. So I'm looking for well-funded projects to keep us going on that in that domain. As for a grammar of multimodal grammar, I don't think that's going to happen anytime real soon, but we are making huge strides. I should mention one other thing. I'm involved now with a project going on in Denmark. You might know about it. Jakob Stensig is, pardon my Danish, I'm doing my best, is beginning a project on what would an interactional grammar look like. And there'll be a book coming out in the next, I think, year or so, where people are trying to grapple with that question. What would call it an interactional grammar, maybe not a reference grammar, because there might not be any paradigms, but I'm more and more impressed as a lifelong language learner with how little we need a paradigm of first, second, and third, present, past, future, we don't need those kinds of charts. We need to understand language as it's happening around us. And maybe an interactional grammar would begin by talking about things that people do a lot in their interactional encounters. So, yeah, it was fascinating to think of. Yeah. And once you have a few decades under your belt, you know that things change rapidly and sometimes unpredictably. And the same is true in our field. So I think it's quite fascinating.
For young scholars, regardless of the era they are in, regardless of the equipment they have, methodologies they use, what are the basic, career linguistic, preparation do you think, they should have,
Good
to be a
question.
successful,
Yes.
linguist?
Yes, good question. I've thought about this a lot too as the years go by, and I've long felt and still do feel responsible for training people to enter a thriving job market, and where are the jobs for linguists. So if I were probably able to be a little more active in the field, I think I would put in some time and energy on something that the LSA is sponsoring called something like careers in linguistics, or industry, and then industry careers, non-academic careers. What's out there? What can we contribute to? And I've long felt a heavy responsibility to make, at least in my corner of the academic world, to make this available to, grad students, especially. Undergrads, I'm not so concerned. A lot of them are keen on studying something they like and, take it from there. Like, I think a lot of us were, and we all know young people like that, but they can find jobs in related fields where I think the field of language disorders, speech pathology, and so forth have long claimed our undergrad population. It depends a lot on the department. Your department could train people for jobs not outside academia, but outside of linguistics departments, because, more and more language and culture departments are realizing how important linguists are. And there's the whole language, linguistics, and education. And our department here at UCSB has been quite forward thinking, thanks especially to Mary Buchholz, who's quite feels this responsibility very heavily, and is concerned to make sure that we are training students who will have options. Academically, if again, my own experience just suggests that it's important to stay realistic and try and gauge the field that's keeping your what is the expression, your ear close to the ground, and seeing where things look like they're heading. It's a difficult part of the job, of being an academic and training new people. And right now, I can't really say. In fact, different parts of the world are operating in different ways in this regard. Europe at the moment seems to be more active in interactional linguistics than this country, in terms of just number of practitioners. On the other hand, it's often difficult to get a job in Europe too. So, as we all know. Yeah.
Well, talking about training, let me just ask you this. As we so well know, you're a very successful and well-loved teacher, mentor. And so, what can you pass on to others about your approach to teaching and mentoring that's made you so successful?
You're very,
But it's
more than true. I think if there's anything I could say is that I've been the fortunate one to be in a place where I get to interact with and work closely with and have fun with so many good students. So I love it. When I decided to retire, it was obvious to me that I would have to make an adjustment. Slowly, I would not be getting as many students to mentor, and the mentoring and the joy and pleasure of learning from students like you has just made my life. If anybody finds they love their teaching and they care about communicating what they can and learning what they don't know to communicate with it, I would say they are well set up to be good mentors. And just from the word on the street, by the way, you both have that innately. I don't think any of it comes from me, but you have both been, fantastic mentors. So I think basically, in my experience, I consider it my good fortune to love that kind of work and care about the people to whom I can, with whom I can share the little bits that I know, the things I've learned over the years. I don't know if that's helpful, but you know as much about it as I do. Yeah, no, I've been so fortunate. Yeah. Conferences have also been a huge part of my life, and I have to say, again, with the two of you, IPRA is probably the most significant conference and organization, but the conferences have been so meaningful, giving all of us a chance to get together, expose ourselves to new ideas and new ways of, everybody knows about that. You listen to papers, but you also reconnect with people that you can learn from. So yeah, probably the most important organization. I've stopped, membership in a few organizations, but never IPRA, because IPRA just brings together such a wide range of people in a very non-judgmental way and non-antagonistic way. It's not, there's no us against them in IPRA. Yeah. So, I mean, maybe some, but it's buried, well hidden. So, yeah.
I think another admirable quality of you is that you have been so successful in collaborating with colleagues and also students. And what's your secrets in working with other people? It's not always easy, thing to collaborate. Working with different.
I appreciate that. Yeah, that's always been my favorite way of working. I know it isn't for everybody. I know lots of successful folks who, rarely collaborate. And I think it depends on how much you are open to seeing things from someone else's point of view. I don't know. I know that I've always enjoyed that, and maybe because I also always feel like I'm learning new things. So I don't often go into a project thinking this is the way it has to be. I go into a project thinking we could work on this together. I could learn something. I have a few ideas, but I think that I could profitably team up with some other folks. And we can push this farther. And I always feel like what results is bigger than I at least could have done by myself. So sometimes I think maybe the co-author could have done it by themselves, but then I wouldn't have learned so much. So I don't know if there's any secret. It's maybe personal inclination. Some people would rather work things out in their own minds, and some people would rather work them out with other folks. So yeah, most people who know me know that I like to, I think of it as, let's jump in the sandbox and build a sandcastle together. I know how I want the front to look, but you have to help me put the back and the sides and something like that. So yeah, something comes out of the collaboration that's, it's bigger than both, or three or five or whatever it is. Yeah. So yeah, maybe a personal inclination. And it's either way is neither good nor bad. It's maybe because I have so much to learn. So yeah.
So I think another secret recipe I think a lot of people would be interested in is to find out how you can keep going, going strong, and being successful for so long. That's really remarkable.
If I can do it, anybody can do it. I know I'm very fortunate again because I have very good health, and I have very nurturing home life. So that's also really wonderful. And I've just had so many, what should I say? So much joy comes back to it that comes back to me that it hasn't been hard to want to keep going. Adjusting all along for, as I get older, I realize that certain things matter more than others. I may have to, during the pandemic, we all wondered if we're ever going to go to another conference again. So who knows if I'm in good shape to start conferencing. So little by little, you realize I can do some of this better than others. It's no secret. But I'm also fortunate that um, I've long been always had this drive or this motivation, and some people lose that. And I know we all know folks who just don't feel like continuing or pushing it. Maybe it was a little bit like that when I retired from teaching. I really didn't like to do that, but I recognized my body was telling me it's about time. So I didn't lose my motivation for teaching, but I lost the ability to maintain that level of urgency and energy. And I know a lot of folks say the same kind of thing. So in a way, I've been lucky to be able to say, I think I'll graduate from teaching and focus on these things. So in a way, I'm like everyone else. Maybe I've been able to continue as long as I have, partly because that fascination, that drive, there's always new stuff to read and think about. That's stayed with me. So I'm lucky with that. And I'm lucky with physical health. So I can still do a lot of what I want to do. Typing has become a little harder. I make more mistakes, but so yeah, in a way, anybody who wants to and has the physical capability can keep going. I predict, you two are already showing signs of that. Yeah, sure. I don't know if there's any other secret, but finding your passion is, the thing that they make, lots of movies about. And I've just been lucky. Yeah.
Well, anything else important to say about life and linguistics?
Thank you. It's been fun to be able to share, some of this. Not everyone you run into at the gym cares about Ohio State or, so it's fun to share what I've been through. And you've known me for a long time. So I appreciate your giving me a chance to talk about life in my corner of linguistics.
Thank you so much, Sandy.
Yeah, that's
Pleasure.
Great pleasure. Thank you.